The original Excitebike is a classic. It's a deceptively deep game considering it was originally released in 1985, and aside from the minuscule number of tracks, it doesn't have any obvious flaws. Stop and ask anyone in the street and they'll probably have nothing but good things to say about it. There's no one actually on my street at the moment, but if there was, I'd ask them. Sure, it may not be as well respected as some of the other black box titles for the NES, but it's clearly a game that Nintendo has a lot of affection for. After all, it's been re-released on a range of systems, had cameos in WarioWare and Animal Crossing, was included in NES Remix, got a 3D quasi-remake on the Wii, and there's even a new track based around it in Mario Kart 8. So with all this in mind, it's perhaps a little unusual to find that it's received just one sequel. With that game, of course, being Excitebike 64 on the N64, released way back in the year 2000. This means it must have been terrible if it was to start a drought for the series lasting 15 years and counting, right? Right? Well, actually, no. Really, the worst thing I can say about Excitebike 64 is that it's very much a game of its time, and all its main problems stem from that fact. There's the obligatory dated 3D visuals, which despite being impressive at the time, don't hold up too well today. There's a little bit of pop-up, amusingly stilted crashes, and some of the settings are eye-bleeding in the extreme, such as this snow stage where I genuinely can't make out where to go sometimes. Maybe that's intentional as part of its off-road style though. Then there are some parts of the presentation that feel truly archaic nowadays, such as the patchwork quilt commentary, which can sometimes sound a little jarring. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, there's the fact that to control it you have to use this contraption. Personally, I don't despise the N64 pad as much as some do, but despite being revolutionary back in the day, time has not been kind to its strange three-pronged design, an analog stick that's as kind to your thumb as a 24-hour session of tiddlywinks. But look past the creaky visuals and even creakier controller, and there's a lot to enjoy and admire here. It pays tribute to its predecessor and employs many of its key elements, but also expands and improves upon them, which is what a good sequel should do, really. The NES Excitebike had a lot of aspects to master after all, considering it was played using a controller with less buttons than what passes for a Fisher-Price toy nowadays. There's the turbo system, which you have to use to your advantage without overheating, making sure you're balanced when making landings off the many ramps, and clashes with your opponents that you have to be sure to come out the right side of. All these elements are present in the N64 iteration, and although some work better than others, what causes you to crash seems to be very random at times, it importantly feels like the original Excitebike, but in 3D. The controls are hard to get to grips with at first, but are satisfying when mastered, with the shoulder buttons allowing you to make tight corners with ease. Maintaining a jump by holding back the analog stick just feels right too. It also goes beyond the often repetitive track design of the original and branches out into other locations and surfaces, including a desert and a building site. The track creator mode also returns, but allows for much more complex creations without being any harder to use. Overall, this is what I imagine the creators of the original Excitebike would look to make if they designed the game using the N64 development kit, and that's a pretty big compliment in my book. Sure, it doesn't feel as classic as the original, but as stated before, that's as much to do with the technology at the developer's disposal than anything else. Pixels will almost always age more gracefully than polygons after all. So it's a little cruel that Excitebike 64 never really had the chance to make as much of an impact as its predecessor. Amongst the last 20 official N64 games to be released, it didn't have as large an audience to tap into, and was soon forgotten amongst the new wave of systems, including the PlayStation 2, Xbox and GameCube. So is that why there's not been a single proper sequel since? Perhaps, but there is a game that arguably could have been Excitebike 64's spiritual successor. Nitro Bike for the Wii. It was also released on the PlayStation 2 in North America, but that doesn't quite fit into the narrative I'm trying to weave here, so I'll ignore that. The main reason to be optimistic about this game is that it's actually developed by Left Field Productions, the team behind Excitebike 64, but was published by Ubisoft, not Nintendo. Sadly though, it's not a hidden gem that's begging to be uncovered, but simply a huge slab of fool's gold. Instead of looking to fit in with the Wii's general ethos of clear and colourful games that can be played by all, it attempts to be a bit darker and complex, and ends up falling flat on its face. It's a bit like watching Marilyn Manson trip over a kitten. Its unpleasant punk aesthetic isn't enough to dismiss it out of hand, of course, as you could argue the Excitebike titles don't have a huge amount of personality either. The only difference between bikers in the original is their colour, after all. But Nitrobike just doesn't feel much fun to play. The motion controls surprisingly aren't too bad, but it's other parts that are much more clumsy, such as the fact that you have to click through screen after screen to save after every stage, and sections of track where you can barely see anything because they're so poorly lit. This may sound like nitpicking, but coupled with the grimy visuals, it just makes this an experience that you have to drag yourself through. It's amusing how text flashes in a panic on the screen when you saunter more than a millimetre off the track too. This surely isn't in the spirit of the rebellious presentation. I do like the fact that you just explode if you use your turbo too much though. Still, gratuitous explosions can't stop Nitrobike feeling like a missed opportunity. And Left Field Productions, after churning out the poorly reviewed Score International Baja 1000 and a poker title in 2008 and 2009 respectively, have now seemingly disappeared from the gaming scene altogether. But fear not, as there's actually something on the Wii that does manage to capture some of the Excitebike magic. It's Excite Truck. Now hear me out. I'm aware there's a bit of a difference between a truck and a motorbike, but there's far more to this Nintendo published effort than meets the eye. After all, from the bran flake bland box to the ear shrivelling music, it seems to be just another racer that's only purpose is to utilise those tacky plastic wheel accessories, and not much else. But it's actually a huge amount of fun. It revolves around gaining a specific number of stars to pass a stage, with these given for where you finish, and also for the manoeuvres you pull off during a race. This is an interesting setup in itself, but, most relevant of all, there's so much here that reminds me of Excitebike. The turbo meter, which causes you to spew smoke if you use it too much, the huge jumps, the constantly shifting terrain, and the way you have to angle your vehicle to stay airborne. The latter is controlled by tilting the remote too, which works well. The entire motion control setup is perfectly judged in fact. It's just a joy to play, and is well worth looking into if you haven't. It feels perhaps a little faster than a bike game would be, but with a few tweaks this easily could have been the latest entry in the Excitebike series. Just add a 4-player mode and a track creator and you're all set. So why wasn't Excite Truck Excitebike? The developer behind it, Monster Games, even went on to create Excitebike World Rally for the Wii's eShop, which is a remake of sorts of the original NES game. So there's the ideal team in place to take up the task of creating a brand new installment in the series. Perhaps Nintendo no longer see any need for a bike game now that you can tear it up on Mario Kart with 2 wheels, but there's surely a place for Excitebike on the Wii U beyond simply giving it constant cameo appearances. The gamepad would be the ideal tool for a fully featured course creator after all, and the Mario Kart 8 track alone shows how elements of the original game can be fused with the new to hugely satisfying effect. Ultimately, Nintendo have not one, but 2 well-loved racing game series currently residing in the gaming junkyard though, with the other one being F-Zero. Perhaps the 2 recent Mario Kart tracks referencing both is a sign we're about to get a truly spectacular comeback double bill. We can only wait and hope. Hey, thanks for watching, I appreciate it a great deal. Please do share this video with anyone you think would enjoy it, and if you have any feedback, positive or negative, please do let me know in the comments section below. Before I forget, you can also like Retro Revisited on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. You know, if you want. The links are in this video's description. I don't think there's anyone coming.
So, you made it here alive.